Fletcher. I'm an associate professor here at Wageningen University. I'm getting close. But that's only a side job. I'd also like to welcome you to my hotel. I hope you're enjoying your stay. I'll be moderating this evening's session. In this capacity, it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome our second keynote speaker, Kumi Naidoo. As I'm sure you all know, he served as International Executive Director of Greenpeace from 2009 to 2015. During this time, he actually also served as a volunteer on the front line of some of the campaigns that he directed, as a result of which he actually spent 4 nights in the Greenlandic prison. Prior to joining Greenpeace, he spent many years working human rights campaigns in South Africa, in the course of which he was also arrested numerous times. During this work, he founded and or headed a number of different organizations and initiatives, including the South African National NGO Coalition, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, and Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. He's also been involved in a wide number of other global policy initiatives, including the Partnership for Transparency Fund, the Limited Persons Panel on UN Civil Society Relations, the Global Campaign for Climate Action, and the UN Men Engaged Board. Somehow during this time as well, he was also able to find the time to earn a doctorate in political sociology from Oxford University, where he also served as a Rhodes Scholar. And finally, I wanted to mention that for many of us, he is perhaps well known for having famously tweeted from the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012 about the conference summary document, which is optimistically titled The Future We Want, and he called it, and I quote, the largest suicide note in history. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Robert. That's a rather cheery note to start with. Suicide note, longest suicide note in history. Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers and sisters, let me start by saying that I'm pretty nervous about being here at this conference because I don't really get a chance to speak to academics that much. And during the break, I was being interviewed, and a very nice person interviewing me said, "So what do you think about the conference so far?" I said, "Oh no, I'm learning a lot." He said, "Yeah, but the language is technical and so on, but everybody seems to know what it means." I said, "Yeah, don't worry, some of them like me are pretending that they know all." But there's another reason that I'm nervous, because pretty much everywhere I speak these days, one of the responses is like what I received in the US a couple of months ago, when at the end of the speech, after having talked about how our oceans are collapsing, our forests are disappearing, how close we are to the climate cliff, women at the President time put up a hand and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of a person called Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, of course I've heard of him. He inspired me and many of my fellow activists in the anti-apartheid struggle." And then she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" Thinking that it was a trick question, I very gently said, I have a dream." And she shouted back, "Yes, it was I Have a Dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds as if you have a nightmare." And therein lies one of the key challenges both for academics as well as for activists. How can we speak truth to power on the one hand, but do not do it in a way that immobilizes and demobilizes and put people in a state of depression? How can we actually talk about the moment of history that we find ourselves in, where we are in deep, and if I can just use the academic term here, deep shit, right? How can we talk about it in that way, but do it in a way that actually is optimistic, honest, and motivational? That is why I've called my presentation today, Resisting Cognitive Dissonance. Also, I thought, it's an academic audience, let me find a big term I can use. I don't think I'm a complete idiot. And the longer title is The Critical Need to Move from an Approach of System Maintenance and Protection to System Redesign and Transformation. Now, for those of you who don't come from psychology and are not familiar with cognitive dissonance, you can read that definition up there on the board. But let me just give you an example, because the examples are better, of a moment of cognitive dissonance in recent history. Do you remember that moment when the US troops finally got to Baghdad and where Saddam Hussein's communications minister was still in power and was still doing press conferences? And the journalists were asking him, how are you coping with the shock and awe of the US military, and how long do you think you can withstand this war, and so on? And he stood there and said, what war? What are you talking about? We have everything under control, and behind him, buildings were burning, bombs were dropping. And that is the reality that we face today, where most of our political and business leadership are suffering a terrible case of cognitive dissonance, which is denial of how serious things are. But problematically, I want to suggest that even the environment movement and most of the so-called progressives and left and ultra-left, or whatever terms you want to use, I would say that even we are actually suffering from a case of cognitive dissonance when we look at our lives, our lifestyles, our own consumption patterns, and so on. It does not reflect the kind of urgency of the moment that we find ourselves in. Now, part of the problem is how do we actually understand the quagmire that we find ourselves in. And I want to introduce this short speech from Martin Luther King from 1961 that I think that is extremely helpful.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live a well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic, schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society, some things in our world, which I'm proud to be maladjusted. I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
So, my question to you before I move on, if I can get the technology to work. Okay, so, how many of you think you are maladjusted in the way that is spoken about? Okay, good. I want to suggest, actually, that if we are brutally honest, that irrespective of where we come from today, the ideological state apparatus before us actually leaves most of us pretty well adjusted to a range of abnormalities, right? The way, let me give you a personal thing. Those of you who are on an EU or US passport, please put up your hand. Okay, so if today somebody from South Africa called you and said, I'm sending you a ticket to come and have a holiday at the Kruger National Park, and let's say that person was somebody you wanted to spend time with, but the person says to you, you need to jump on a flight tomorrow night, or maybe this evening, you can do it. If I got that invitation, I couldn't. I need 2 weeks to go apply for a visa and blah, blah, blah. And I jokingly say if I were to write a book about an autobiography of my time at Greenpeace, it would be called, and previously at Civicus, it would be called Visas Fucking Visas. And let's be clear, this is a problem because it's a curtailment of international civic mobility, right? The ability of people from the global south to actually participate in activism around the World Bank and the IMF and so on. It's restricted just by movement. So I'm arguing that right now we need to be thinking about being proud about being maladjusted. And that last thing I want to just repeat, okay, where it says, I refuse to be well adjusted to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are trapped in an airtight cage of poverty. And my dear brothers and sisters, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, all of us have adapted to an immoral level of inequality in the way we think, the way we act, and so on. And I think there's an intellectual challenge that has to be addressed very, very strongly. Now, I just want to use the 3 C's of the conference for my structure. So, very obvious, of course, the capitalist system is deeply flawed. We know that a handful of people hold more wealth than the bottom 3 million. We know that the system encourages, consciously encourages, and requires unsustainable and overconsumption. You remember that moment after 9/11 when the US economy was in a bad way and President Bush did one of his press conferences and he said, buy, buy, buy. You know, go consume, consume, consume. And that model of economic growth and economics is clearly flawed. But importantly, according to a report from WWF some years ago in 2015, but an earlier report said something similar, we would require 3.9 planets for everyone to reach the average consumption levels of the United States. And as we have often said, we have to address climate change courageously because we don't have a plan B, because we don't have a planet B. And so right now, what we are seeing is China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and so on, all trying to mimic the patterns of consumption that the United States, Europe, and so on has told the world, this is normal. The other problem we have is this. We are suffering from a medical problem, not influenza, but affluenza. Right? And when I talk about the problem of affluenza, and quite frankly, I think the absolute rich are suffering a pathology. Right? They actually are sick in the sense that they believe that their happiness and well-being and so on has to come from extremely immoral, unjustified, vain consumption in the light of so many people having so little. But also, those of us who do not have it, those of us who are poor, we also suffer from the problem of affluenza because that is our aspirations. We've been told that's what constitutes success. I'll give you a personal example. When I go to Durban, I come from a working class family and I go check out my aunts and uncles and as my grandmother used to say, because she had 12 kids, she used to say, in those days we had no TV, son. That's why I had 12 kids. But I have a lot of, I have just within my family quite a good sample to actually get a sense of the vibe. And so I'll ask, by the way, how's that friend doing? And they say, oh yeah, that friend is doing really well. He's bought a new house, he's got a new job, he's got a new car. And I say, yeah, how's his wife and kids? Oh no, he got divorced 2 years ago, he doesn't even have access to his kids and so on. But he's doing well. You know, so there is some fundamental problems of how, in fact, we have been, I would say, contaminated in our thinking about what constitutes a decent, good, and prosperous life. So the bottom line is we are either comfortable with gross inequality or are we willing to push the planet beyond these boundaries trying to reach US and developed world consumption levels. Clearly, faith in the free market is unfounded and wealth is not trickling down. And we have to, if you look at the moment after the global financial crisis, the response of those with power was recovery of the system, protection of the system, maintenance of the system. But that was a moment where there was a possibility of addressing the questions of how does the system need to be redesigned, transformed, and with more innovation. And I should tell you that when I was chairing the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, I was addressing a meeting once in the Pacific, and somebody put up their hand and said, "You got the name of the campaign wrong." And the campaign is called Make Poverty History. And I said, "Okay, what's the right title?" The person said, the name of the campaign should have been Make Affluence History, because it is a connection, because some require so much in terms of consumption, others are going to have less. It's not unrelated. So inequality, as you know, is a fantastically huge problem. And I'm leaving this for your imagination. The slide looks like this, because if that is the richest people in the world, do you know how far it goes for the rest? This is like not even 10% of the world's population. Okay. When we look specifically at nature in the capitalist system, we've seen, of course, people have talked about it, commodification of nature, privatization of environmental resources in the trend. But one of the key challenges is, how do you enter struggle? How do you actually try to shift the system? And part of what is often said is that the reality of effective activism is to start with the status quo. When I was a young activist, I read something that came out of Asia, from the Rural Development Movement there, where they said, go to the people, live with them, learn from them. Start with what they know, build on what they understand, and march alongside them. And when the struggle has been won, people should say, we have done it ourselves. Now, the challenge we have is the balance of forces are so heavily in favor of those with power and control at the moment. So to intervene and to change things, you can either set out the most progressive position, which I think we have the right and a duty to do. But on the other hand, do you set out that position which potentially sets you so far out from the mainstream that in fact the mainstream can completely ignore you because they know you don't have a chance? Or do you, while laying out what an alternative vision is, also try to disrupt the system from within? So for many local communities around the world, they have to deal with the reality of what they confront on a day-to-day basis. And I think for many campaigning organizations, that's the same. I can go into a little more detail there, hopefully, during the question time. So sometimes the approaches need to be pragmatic, and it is necessary. That does not mean if organization or movement X participates in a struggle, does its best, and does not get 100% at the end of it, that they have necessarily failed if they have actually reduced the power of those that are in the way. Now, if I look at many struggles, including some that I've been involved directly, one of the challenges you always have is how do you broaden what you call the people's camp. You make an analysis of who's on your side, who's on the other side, and then you say, okay, if we are to win, we have to broaden our base, right? And broadening the base requires you to talk to people who are different from you, people who don't speak the language that you do, people who don't have the education that you do, and so on. And that is hard, slog political work, and that is what we cannot escape. So incremental changes aimed at improving a flawed system is not going to solve the problem, right? But it's a question of naming it, and so on. And yeah, let me be self-critical. I've been part of movements over time where the imperative of showing that you're moving forward, you sometimes overstate the success of a particular way, right? And there are all sorts of pressures of why you need to do that. I'm not justifying it, I can understand it, but I'm saying right now, we have to be talking with much greater honesty. So, when the global financial crisis hit, what we had was a convergence of a range of crises: the ongoing poverty crisis, the climate crisis, the gender inequality crisis, and of course the financial crisis. And it was President Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, now the mayor of Chicago, who said, a good crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And quite frankly, we wasted that crisis. And the moment of history we're in has been, you know, some have called it the perfect storm. In a book that I I wrote in 2010, I call it the boiling point. But irrespective of what you call it, the moment that we're in is a moment that should be a moment of wake up and understand that urgency needs to be intensified. So moving to the second word of the conference, which is contestation. I would argue that two of the most difficult areas of activism in the world today is around climate and around finance. And here I want to suggest that even progressive academics, as well as progressive NGOs, are partly to blame for the way we talk and the way we articulate ourselves. Because in fact, one of the reasons I would suggest why in fact we struggle so much to make progress, this is not a main reason, but one of the reasons in terms of building movements to address climate and so on, is that in fact we talk in ways that actually exclude people from the conversation. Now those with power are doing it quite consciously. Right? Those with power are doing it quite consciously. Let me just quickly ask, those of you when the news bulletin, you know when you get to that point where they do financial news, how many of you feel you fully understand what they are saying? I'm assuming everybody is educated. Some of you are economists, some of you are not. But somebody like me who's not an economist, how many of you feel when you read just the basics about markets and the shares and whatever, how many of you feel you have a good sense of understanding of what's happening? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Economist? MBA, okay. All right. So think about it. The way information is managed is and I want to humbly suggest that those of us, even on the progressive side, those of us in these movements, actually have compounded the problem and actually unwittingly have excluded many people from the conversation. Quick example. When I started at Greenpeace, I had to go to Copenhagen in the first 2 weeks to lead the Greenpeace delegation to the climate talks. And I'm sitting down with my new colleagues at Greenpeace, and we're getting briefed about what's going to happen. And within the first 5 minutes, 6 times I had to turn to the person next to me and say, what does that acronym mean? What does that acronym mean? And then about the 7th time was a term called LULUCF. How many of you know what's LULUCF? Oh, you sad people, you. So, those of you don't know, don't worry. But I'll just give you an example. A few years later, I end up supporting Ban Ki-moon in Hollywood, reaching out to the film producers and writers and so on to say, what we need from you guys is that you need to start subliminally emerging in soap operas and normal programming, climate, peace, and development messages. Right? So I was on a panel, and Larry King, you might remember him from CNN, was moderating, and he came to me. So I said to these people, you guys need to help us to communicate in more accessible ways. You can reach larger numbers of people, and then I tell them, the story about LULUCF, and I said, you'll be aware of what is wrong in society. But awareness does not mean awareness translates into action, and that awareness develops into consciousness, and I, in my PhD thesis, called consciousness applied awareness, where you have awareness, but you want to do something with that awareness. And not always, but often can turn into mass action and resistance. One of the biggest problems we have is that most of the time when we are organizing around these issues, we actually think that the biggest problem we have is the repressive state apparatus. The army, the police, formal laws, and so on. And let me just say, the repressive state apparatus is the big challenge for us right now in a context where in more than 95 countries around the world as we speak here, there are active attempts by the state to actually shrink democratic space generally, but to specifically shrink the space for civil society and particularly the rights of freedom of association, assembly, and association. Louis Althusser, sorry, I'm reflecting my age now by quoting Althusser. How many of you know who Althusser is? I think that's the older people. So Althusser made, I think, one of the most important contributions to understanding how power works, because he made this distinction between what he called the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus. And basically was arguing that actually the ideological state apparatus is in fact much more insidious and much more powerful in controlling society. So the United States does not need, the US regime does not need to deploy its repressive state apparatus, well generally it doesn't need to internally within the continental US, because the repressive state apparatus is so successful, which has created a problem which Cornel West calls inverted authoritarianism, where in fact the very people that are being oppressed actually will fight against the things that are in their interests, such as the response you saw around healthcare reform. And we know the commercialized media has actually become a big part of the problem, but the ideological state apparatus is not just the media environment, it's a framework for education, schooling, and university. And we know our universities increasingly are being corporatized, are being compromised, and I know many of you probably have horror stories about compromises you might have needed to make around a funding deal or whatever. Unless, of course, all of you manage to somehow be angels and escape that trip, which I hope you were able to do. So the bottom line is, if we are honest, we all need to acknowledge that given the severity of the crisis that we find ourselves in, we are not doing enough. Now, I can see some people on the verge of tears, so let me just stop and make a positive one. Environmentalists love to say, save the environment, save the climate, save the planet. I got good news for you. The planet does not need saving. The planet is just fine. Because if we continue on the trajectory that we are, where will we end up? We will warm the planet to a point where water, land, and food is scarce, and ultimately the heat levels will go up to a point, as is already happening in Africa, where places will become uninhabitable. So the end result is, we will be gone. The planet will still be here. It will be bruised, scattered, and scarred by humanity's crimes on it. But actually, once we get out of the way and become extinct, the planet will be fine. The oceans will recover, the forests will grow back, and so on. Don't worry about it. This struggle is fundamentally about whether humanity can fashion a way to mutually coexist with nature in a mutually dependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about securing our children and their children's futures. And given what is at stake, we have to begin to question the issue of what is the quality of democracy. So the role of the state conventionally was to mediate between the different interests. So a good government is one who listens to what business says, what civil society says, what other religious interests and so on, but plays a mediating role. Clearly, we know that most of our governments and states have been captured by a very small elitist interest. And I think the contribution made by the Occupy movement of framing the 99% versus the 1% was a very helpful framing. Now, there are a range of websites, by the way, where you can go and you can put your salary and it will tell you exactly where you are in the global rankings of compensation. I would invite you tonight to do that. Find one of those websites, K International as well. Put your salary and then actually look at yourself and say, wow, I would be surprised if many of us in this room, counting myself within it, are not in the top 10%. And many will be even above that. And that raises questions about, in feminist movement always says the personal is the political. And if we are saying consumption patterns are a problem and so on, then we also have to begin to be asking ourselves whether in fact the very lives that we lead are actually defendable and sustainable and translatable to, if not everybody on the planet, but to a significant majority on the planet. So we are seeing multiple cases of where governments have been seriously captured, but interestingly to look at the United States here, because the United States I describe as the best democracy money can buy. And in partly I'm choosing the US because the US puts itself out as a promoter of democracy. And the more accurate description of the US is it's a liberal oligarchy. which has the form of democracy without the substance of democracy. I would argue many European countries have much stronger democracies in that sense. There's more diversity and so on. I mean, the US is not a two-party system, it's a one-and-a-half-party system. When you look at the fact that both the parties have so much of similarity in terms of the policy positions, for example. And if you take how the lobbying works, it's crazy. Just in the fossil fuel industry, every member of the US Congress, the fossil fuel industry comes up with enough money on an annual basis to ensure that the most insignificant member of Congress who has no fossil fuel interests in the state will have 2 full-time lobbyists trained on them, and sometimes up to 8 full-time lobbyists. So if you're wondering why even people who are supposedly more liberal, not left, but more liberal in the US actually won't take strong positions on climate, it's because they are completely constrained by the very people that have funded the election campaigns and so on. I mean, who was President George W. Bush? That election was bought for him, lock, stock, and barrel by the interests of the fossil fuels. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit faster. And so I was going to show you a little video, but I'm going to pass it in the interest of time. But I'll tell you, go on YouTube and Google Matt Damon. YouTube, Matt Damon and Howard Zinn, where basically what he talks about there is in fact, Howard Zinn, I think people know as a famous US labor historian, and he contests the notion of the rule of law. And he says that in fact today, the rule of law has become the darling, this was in the 60s anyway, the rule of law has become the darling of those in power and a terrifying thing for those who do not have power, right? And then in terms of civil disobedience, it's well said in the video, where basically the argument is that often when you talk about civil disobedience, we talk about the problem of civil disobedience. But the problem we have is not civil disobedience, but the problem we have is actually civil obedience. We are far too obedient to things that do not warrant any respect and so on. So, bottom line is, we need to intensify peaceful civil disobedience, recognizing that no struggle has ever been won without sacrifice, casualties, and pain. And climate change is the game changer, because there's a clock ticking. You know, we've done pathetically, I would say, as a species on gender equality, on inequality more generally, and so on. But all of those things where we've not done well, we have a chance to redo and retry and push and push and push. But let's be clear, on climate, we are 5 minutes before midnight. And we ignore the urgency and the reality that the window to take the action is small and shrinking very, very fast. As the head of the Global Trade Union Movement, Sharon Burrows, puts it, there are no jobs on a dead planet. And therefore, one of the exciting things that we have seen is that more and more people are actually gravitating from unlikely quarters into the climate struggle, including the unions, including faith organizations, and a range of social movements. So, one of the problems with climate activism is that it has been framed by, you can never say that this problem is related to climate change, because the causality is not very easy to show. It's never linear, and it makes it difficult. But one of the things that's critically necessary is we have to liberate the challenge of climate change from it being framed as an environmental issue. It has to be seen as a cross-cutting issue, an economic issue, a gender issue, because we know, as the CIA says already in 2002, that in the coming decades, the biggest threat to peace, security, and stability will not come from conventional threats or from terrorism, but in fact will come from the impacts of climate change. And in the Middle East and in Africa in particular, we are seeing ample evidence of it. So we've also seen how dominant the military is, and the military industry has been. We see the military-industrial complex still wield amazing power. The promise of a peace dividend when the Berlin Wall came down has not been delivered. Military expenditure has only risen. If you look at conflict is pretty big business, and if you look at those figures, yes, after 89 there was a slight drop, but we are now back on an increased pathway of spending. And if you look at how we prioritize, if you take the goal of eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, receives 102 billion. Global military spending in 2009 was 1.53 trillion. Then on the North-South conflict, everybody now wants to say, not everybody, a lot of people want to say when you go to meetings and negotiations, the North-South divide, is really not relevant anymore, because you've got China there and Brazil and India and so on. The reality is that yes, the North-South dynamic has changed quite substantially, but we are in denial to actually say that the historical accumulation of carbon, greenhouse gases and so on, and that history can be wiped out, and the consumption pattern still in the North versus the South is fundamentally broken. And yesterday we had a good example of it when the Chilcot inquiry was given. If Tony Blair was an African leader, you'd be sitting at the International Criminal Court together with George Bush. Let's be blunt about it, right? There are different rules that apply in the global governance system, which is completely broken for leaders from developed countries versus leaders from developing countries. I supported and advocated for the International Criminal Court. It pains me that many of the African countries now are saying we are going to step out of the International Criminal Court. But I have to say, regrettably, I find it hard to argue when there's such an inconsistency in application in terms of how, when a Tony Blair or a George Bush engages in a violation of international law and in the murder of thousands and thousands of people, and they get away with it scot-free, and they still have respectability. And yes, those folks from the continent that sit in those prisons should sit in those prisons, definitely. But the fact that others get away with it has undermined, even if we look at the UN Security Council, why does UK and France have a veto at the Security Council? In 1945, there were colonial hegemons controlling large portions of the world's population. But today, the only argument why a country like France and Britain should have a veto is, if you're looking at population size, is because they hold weapons of mass destruction in the form of nuclear weapons. So we've got a global governance system that is suffering from four deficits: a democratic deficit, a coherence deficit, a compliance deficit, and therefore also a legitimacy deficit. So I'm going to move to my conclusion, and I'll send you and just to say that in Africa right now, I'm involved in a process of building a bottom-up movement called Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Sustainable Development. And we are in a situation where the continent is hurting big time, our people are hurting big time, our political leaders are failing us, but the global system is exacerbating things for us. And the only solution many of us are saying is that we cannot continue to operate on a continent whose boundaries were drawn by European colonialism in the conference in Berlin. Yes, we got the reality of the nation states as they are, but we have to push for greater social, political, and economic integration. And I put it in a somewhat funny way of saying if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro. I'm not talking about this. So I want to conclude then with a challenge to the field of political ecology. By the way, I have to tell you that when I first got invited for the conference, I had to go to Wikipedia and check what political ecology meant. But here's my challenge to you all as a field. Firstly, do not get engaged in definitional Olympics. What I mean by that is, do not spend huge amounts of time about this is political ecology, this is not political ecology, and do the thing that the left does so well and brilliantly, which disunites itself on the finer distinctions of theory. Right? Yes, a certain amount of intellectual rigor needs to go into it, but please do not make it an obsession. Look for the intersectionalities and so on, because we do not have time, quite frankly, if I can put politely, for excessive intellectual masturbation on the screen. Secondly, take intersectionality very seriously. I think what I liked about the way this was framed is how you brought these three big narratives together and trying to find the intersection. And let's be very clear, the feminist movement decades ago gave us this wisdom. Right? Decades ago, the feminist movement, you know, they gave us a horrific word, but a very powerful concept. I think intersectionality is one of the worst words in English language. But behind that is understanding, you know, how different struggles intersect with each other. Most importantly, I would say, be willing to be called maladjusted, romantic, idealistic, unrealistic, and so on. Because as my daughter told me many years ago when she was about 12, when I said, you know, from my experience, you shouldn't do that, and so on. She said, Dad, the problem with your generation is you're like contaminated by horrific experience, and you'll keep pushing your bad experience on us. So we need to dare to now. We need to dare to think differently and be willing to be called far out, unrealistic, and maladjusted. We also need to give rebirth, I think, to this idea of organic intellectualism. Right? Those of you who remember Antonio Gramsci, or Gramsci as you say, you know, when I was growing up, this whole idea of organic intellectual was very important. In fact, in one demonstration I was in, because our university had very few organic intellectuals at that time, and there were more collaborative intellectuals, and I remember one person from my political science class holding up a banner saying, too few organic intellectuals, too many orgasmic intellectuals. But I think that we have to revisit what does it mean to be a responsible intellectual, right? And I think that you cannot say as a responsible intellectual that the only terrain that I operate in is the ivory tower of the university. You have to be able to insert, and I know I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but far too many people in the academia are actually cut off from reality and what you write and what, you know, and you write for yourselves. To a large extent, the majority of academic output is written for a very small audience. Even my PhD supervisor told me when I was finishing, he said, you need to understand that the people who read this thesis is me, your supervisor, your examiner, and if you're lucky, your dog. Right? So, with those words, I just want to end on a very personal note. I want to not talk to you as academics in conclusion. I want to just say, I'm going to tell you a sad story, but it's intended to be inspiration. When I was 22 years old, I was fleeing home into exile. And my best friend at that time, a guy called Kumi Naidoo, same surname, no relation, said to me, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution anyone can make to the cause of humanity? And I said, that's a very simple question. I said, giving your life. And he said, you mean participating in a demonstration and getting shot and killed, which was happening on a regular basis in South Africa at that time, where you know, it was almost as if a regular ritual that every other weekend you were at the funeral to bury one comrade. I said, yeah, I guess so. He said, no, it's a wrong answer. He said, it's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. Now, my friend Lenny, he was way ahead of us. He was the first environmentalist and knew, and I think at that time he probably was only one of like 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. And he always said, you know, these things. And so, you know, we hugged each other, we fled into exile in different directions, and 2 years later I get the call that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from our home city were brutally murdered by the apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in their bodies, the parents couldn't recognize them at the mortuary. So I had to think deep and hard about this distinction between giving your life and giving the rest of your life. What he was saying very wisely is a struggle for justice, whether it's economic justice, social justice, climate justice, gender justice, and various other struggles. These struggles are not they're not sprints, they're marathons. And the biggest contribution that any one of us can do, whether we're in the academic space, whether we're in the NGO space, whether we're in the trade union space, or any other space, is to have the stamina and the perseverance to actually stay with those struggles, persevere, push and push and push until those struggles are won. And we know there are many histories, including in my part of the world, where there were people who came to power, lots of support and so on, and behave in ways that are so different from what in fact we thought our liberation struggle was about. So I want to say to you that the very fact that you are at a conference like this, you're applying your minds to this intersection of these three clear core agendas, and you're looking to develop a new field that will add to the body of knowledge, but more importantly, to add to the body, to add to more inspired practice, is a positive thing. And so when you, if you are like me, have moments when you actually think, my God, is it worthwhile? Are we out of time? Is it too late? And so on. Just take a step back. Take a couple minutes to feel a bit down, but we don't have the luxury to be feeling too down for too long. And just recognize that the world would be a much more pessimistic place were it not for people like yourselves are being to push the boundaries of knowledge and practice. And I thank you for that, I encourage you for that, and I thank you very much for having a non-academic come and be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a really thoughtful and inspiring engagement with so many of the very difficult issues that we're trying to wrestle with here at this conference. Now to get the discussion started, I would like to invite to the podium Esther Turnhout. Esther is a professor in the Forest and Nature Conservation Group here at the university, and she will begin our discussion with a response.
Thank you, Kumi, for a great talk. Can you hear me now? But I'm not so sure. I have some doubts about that. Are we really able? Are we really willing? Are we really comfortable being civilly disobedient as an academic community? I have some doubts about that, which I'd like to share with you. So I should say that I've been thinking around this theme, and I have some comments to make. They're not fully thought through. They're meant to be like a provocation or some points for discussion to really think through and to really take seriously what it would mean to take this into practice, to put this into practice. What would it mean for us as academics to engage in civil disobedience? Now, first of all, we have to think about what does that mean. I understood civil disobedience as a kind of a radical sort of resistance against powerful forces. So in that sense, it is different from incremental change, right? So you could see civil disobedience as in contrast with incremental change, which operates from the within. And you could also say that many environmental NGOs have become really masters as in operating within the system and contributing to change from within. Now, apparently, this is not enough, and we need to more actively resist. But what does this mean? Actually, if you look at it closely, we have to recognize that the distinction between incremental change and civil disobedience might be one of degree rather than kind. In the sense that in order to resist something, you have to always establish a relation. You have to establish a relation with dominant forces, dominant discourse, and in doing so, you actually reinforce the existence of that dominant system and the dominance of that system. So what it means to be civilly disobedient will differ in different practices, in different contexts. And I would also like to advocate for the value of incrementalism as a form of change, as a power of change. I think empirically speaking, you could even say that incremental movements have been more effective in leading to change in environmental policy, for example, than resistance. There's as many reasons to believe that this is actually powerful force than there are reasons to be kind of against that. Martin Heider's analysis, for example, about ecological modernization discourse offers a useful illustration of how change can work, change from within. And also the current discussion about the Eco-Modernist Manifesto offers quite a useful illustration of the blurry boundaries, maybe, between incremental change on the one hand and civil disobedience on the other hand. So the second reason for being a bit careful about taking this claim on board is actually referring to Charles Lindbergh, who's also actually very old and dead, probably. I can't He made a really, his analysis, he was really an advocate of incrementalism, saying, well, actually, there's important democratic qualities in incremental change. So his argument was rather to warn against utopian and totalitarian visions, right? Comments that were also later echoed in the work of James Scott, for example. So he said, well, you know, radical change can be a very dangerous ideal if you put it into practice, and incrementalism is actually a source of democratic good. My second reason for being cautious or careful about this call for action is related to academic culture and to our use of theory. I think Kumi rightly pointed out that academic debates are often unnecessarily opaque. But I think there's also a big risk that they're overly inward-looking and ultimately irrelevant. So as academics, and maybe I speak for myself, but I kind of hope that you recognize some of what I'm saying, but as academics, we've become very accustomed to criticizing hegemonies, disciplinary power, governmentalities, performativities, whether they are exercised by the state, by corporations, or by environmental NGOs. And this, I think, has made us perhaps a bit uncomfortable with the power that we actually have and that we actually exercise on a daily basis. Because when we as academics criticize dominant discourse and expose the performativity and governmentalities of policies, we are, in fact, constituting discourse ourselves. And we are, in fact, performing our own realities. Now, if this is the case, we are inevitably implicated in and actively intervening in our study object to such an extent that academic ideals that we might cherish of objectivity or critical distance become difficult to uphold. So instead, civil disobedience might mean that we have to make our hands dirty, so to say, and actively engage. Or perhaps more precisely, our hands are already dirty and they have in fact never been clean. But fully appreciating this point requires actually that we have to become brave enough to deliberately start doing what we are already doing, and to deliberately start doing what we're used to criticizing others of. So we have to exercise power. We have to imagine, perform, and constitute alternative realities. But we better make sure that these are good ones, that they're open and that they're hopeful, and that we do so with courage, with imagination, with reflexivity, and in a way that is democratically accountable. If we as an academic community are to make a difference, we have to rethink and reclaim the university, and we have to start doing knowledge differently. And I sincerely hope, with Kumi, I hope, that we as academics, and in collaboration and in conversation with NGOs, with the states and with citizens, are up for this task. But as I started my talk, I'm not so sure. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to offer our keynote speaker a brief space of response, and then we will open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Esther, for those very provocative and thoughtful comments. I just wanted to say two things in response. One is, in terms of civil disobedience as a strategy, history teaches us that whenever humanity faces a big challenge, whether it's slavery, colonialism, women's right to vote, civil rights in the US, apartheid in South Africa, those struggles only move forward when decent men and women stood up and said enough is enough, and no more, we're prepared to put our lives on the line, we're prepared to go to prison if necessary. So civil disobedience as a strategy for change, as a track record that is actually tried and tested, and we have seen in recent times that when there's been, whether it was during the Arab resistance and so on, that actually was able to push quite seismic change. However, it doesn't mean that all of us have to participate in the civil disobedience in the same way, right? I think the role of academics should be to help make sense of what is happening, what are the drivers, explain it to the general public, and so on. That might mean that you will get away without needing to climb an oil rig or occupy a coal plant. However, I am also saying to you that I'm also speaking to you, and the last bit of my speech was to you as a human being, from one human being to another human being. And I'm saying as a human being, and those of you who are parents, and those of you who are planning to be parents, you have a right outside of your life as an academic to step out and push your boundaries of comfort as well. The second and last point of response, I thought you put your finger, Esther, on a very important problematic, and that is the question of those of us who are campaigners for justice, in broad sense. How committed are we to democracy itself? Because we, like say when I was at Greenpeace, what used to happen, we would take a position on an issue. And I would say to my colleagues, so we want the world to follow us, we want people to follow us on a particular issue. But just taking the position and arriving at it and announcing it, that's no hard work. The hard work is doing the job of dialoguing with the people directly affected to move them to be able to embrace the same position that you actually hold, so they will act. If you, from a dizzy height, take a politically pure position and say the world must believe me because I know better and I am politically more sharp or whatever, that is in fact a fundamentally anti-democratic kind of approach, right? So I am saying that what lies ahead of us is tremendously hard work. There are no shortcuts, and if we are going to arrive at a point where we can say we've averted catastrophic climate change, and the only way we will avert catastrophic climate change is if we change the economic system and the political system. There's no way we're going to do that without quite fundamental changes. However, we have to start where people are, and I would like to conclude my contribution to this conversation with a very soft issue, and that is the issue of humanity, how we engage with each other. I find it sometimes, I think criticism and rigorous debate and all is fundamentally good, right? We grow and we get new ideas and so on. But I think it's also important when people are in the front lines of struggle in communities where we do not understand the full story, or movements that we don't understand all the complexities and so on. We should not continue to do what the left does so brilliantly, which is we weaken ourselves, we spend far too much of fighting with ourselves, we sort of take a pleasure almost of like tearing each other apart. We need to create the basis of how we can debate and argue in a rigorous and in a respectful way, where we don't argue against the persons, because quite often that's not what it becomes, but argue against the tactics and strategies involved. And there has to be a greater sense of acceptance and compassion and understanding that people are going to enter the struggle that we engage in from very different starting points. And we do not want somebody who becomes a WWF volunteer, for example, right, who for some people will be not radical enough because they take money from the pockets and so on. But that person joining the movement might be doing it, might be a seismic leap for that person from no activism to join them. And what our responsibility is not to kill that person or to undermine their thing, is to actually lift them up and give them the tools to actually move to, if you want, more radical forms of activism. And understanding that like most things in life, activism is also a very long journey. Thank you.
The question I have is, isn't civil disobedience an oxymoron? because civility, as imposed on activists or those who try to change things in a certain way, civility means be obedient, act in a certain setting of institutionalism or what is considered to be legal. And the reason I'm asking this question is, usually in environmental conflicts, the other party is violent. I studied the case of whaling. Anti-whaling activism has chosen different paths, and it's difficult to simplify. But if you think of the differences between Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd, Sea Shepherd has chosen a more radical way, right? And they say that we're not civil disobedience, we're not protesters, and we can talk about to what extent their violence or their choice of tactics are effective. Maybe one can say that by making the conflictual situation dramatic, they're actually making Japanese have a better hold on the Japanese society, and it's actually counterproductive. But on the other hand, there's a criticism towards peaceful negotiations, that they're actually feeding into this idea that on the legal ground, or what is already set as legal, like International Whaling Commission, that there's a choice in there. But what we've seen for decades is actors always find a way to manipulate loopholes, work outside of the legal arena in those aspects. So when we're given individual cases and the reality of opponents being very violent, again, isn't civil disobedience an oxymoron?
Follow-up. All right, maybe a response to that then, while we collect our thoughts from the debate.
Yes. Yeah, you know, the one thing I learned about words is that we operate here in English, and you know, our civil disobedience translates in different languages. It means, you know, like I remember being in Japan the first time and talking about civil society and the way any Japanese colleagues, any Japanese speaking colleagues. Okay. But okay, now, okay, I was going to say now I can speak more confidently, just in case I get the pronunciation wrong. No, but like the translation, say, of civil society into Japanese is shimenshaki, right? And literal translation is actually citizen society, which, by the way, I think is a much better formulation than civil society. But you're right, there is a contradiction about how it is used. But substantively, you know, by the way, I do not believe that Sea Shepherd is a violent organization, I should just say, right? They push the boundaries more than what Greenpeace would, where, for example, they would use a water cannon on whalers. Greenpeace would not do that because it feels it's crossing the line. But, you know, I don't think it's fair to describe, and you know, the thing about this term violence, you know, we need to understand that poverty is one of the worst violence that we have in the world. Gender inequality is a violence, right? So we have to also, I think, and this is an intellectual project, I think this is a key intellectual project of this time, to actually think about theorizing violence and conflict in a way that is more honest, is more multi-layered, more complex in its analysis and understanding. And you've put your finger on the need for that. I think your question, to me, correctly outlines a problematic, but also is saying that there's a need. And this is an area where a little bit of definitional work will be well received, but please don't spend too much of time on it.
Yes, and I would like to question this idea that incrementalism is more effective and also more democratic. I mean, the Chilcot report came out a couple of days ago, and it showed that the intervention in Iraq was not, I mean, what took place while there were studies, there were scientific studies that showed there were no reasons to believe that there were arms in Iraq. So maybe today it is not the left that is radical. Those who are radical are people like there in Bush.
Yeah. It's always a bit tricky to ask the question back, but I actually don't know what that has to do with the argument that I tried to make about incrementalism. So if I'm off the mark, you'll probably correct me. But my argument about incrementalism is partly to play with the ambiguity that the first question asker rightly pointed out. So civil disobedience is a bit of an ambiguity in that term, which provokes a contradiction, which I think is actually productive. So it also invites us to think about this distinction between incremental and radical change, and to actually think about how they are in fact different. And they might not be so different in practice. It's a distinction of degree and not of kind. My argument about incremental change, I was echoing Lindblom, who was very cautious with utopian and totalitarian ideas, arguing that they are often undemocratic, and I think we've all know many examples of that. Saying, well, incremental change, trial and error approaches, small changes that are not irreversible, accompanied with reflexive and participatory processes, could be a way forward. And some of the environmental legislation in Europe would not have been there, I would say, without those activities. And I would also like to point out that obviously outside or more radical forms of resistance have triggered these processes of incremental change. So they're in dialogue with each other. So what I wanted to say first and foremost is actually blur and problematize the distinction between radical and incremental change, and arguing for the value of caution in some cases, but particularly trying to ask the question, what would be both effective and legitimate in a specific situation at a specific moment in time. Not saying incrementalism is always good and radical change is always bad, or the other way around. Both of them would be too simple.
Sorry, with a hand over here.
My name is Emil Kuijs. I'm a master's student here in Wageningen University. And thank you for the beautiful presentation and your reflection, which I do believe in incremental change very much, and not so much in the system we're talking about, but very much within ourselves and how we communicate amongst each other. And I really like the quote or what you said, like consciousness is applied awareness, where I believe that if we change our contact with ourselves and within nature, that animals very much know what they need if they have a sufficiency in calcium, or I believe if we get in contact with ourselves, we will become a different CEO, a different researcher, or a different activist, and I think that will make that we can make a change.
Let's take 2 more questions before we have our final response. We already have that in. All the way in the back. All the way in the back.
Hi, I've got a question for both speakers actually. Kumi, do you think that you left Greenpeace, or when you left Greenpeace, it was less of an obstacle to addressing climate change than when you joined it? to our other speaker. I wonder whether you could spell out what incremental change looks like for someone who is being forcibly evicted from their home to make way for a national park, or for a dam, or who can't pay their electricity bill or their water bill. What exactly does incremental change look like in those circumstances?
This is to Kumi. Thank you for a very, very inspiring talk. What we have been seeing over the last, I think, couple of years is a lot more sort of radical proposals coming out from all kinds of environmental quarters. It's something that Rob and I have been sort of breaking our heads on. Is, for example, Edward O. Wilson's, famous biologist. He's published a book recently called Half Earth, where he wants the entire, half of the entire Earth protected in officially protected areas. Something that would have, of course, enormous impact on people all over the place. Right? He focuses particularly on those areas with, where people have lots of kids. Very, very problematic. But in the face of all these sort of very different, sort of radical proposals to deal with the environment, sometimes incredibly neoliberal radical proposals as well, how do you, as an activist, bring the more political economic element into that discussion, which you clearly did here? And how can the field of political ecology, i.e. many of us here, support you in that or inspire you in that, and what could you get from us for that?
Thanks. So I think I tried to make a somewhat complex argument that I might not be very clear on. So let me just restate it, right? That what the world needs now is fundamental, structural, systemic change. Our economic system is broken, our political systems are broken, and our approach to protecting our ecological assets is fundamentally flawed. Having said, so that's why I'm saying it's inadequate to simply be looking at system maintenance, system recovery, and system protection, which is the kind of approach. But having said that, let's be blunt about it, lots of ordinary people get impacted by the sort of fluctuations in the current system. So with Brexit, there are some ordinary people who are impacted because the financial system operates in a way where the value of the pound and so on drops. Okay? So let's just be clear. Fundamental change does not only impact the elite, it also impacts ordinary people who have had to adapt to what the current status quo reality is. But why I responded positively to Esther's challenge on the importance of incremental, the place for incremental change, is that activism does, if you ask yourself, how does somebody move from no activism or no public engagement into engagement? Right? There's we can pull out a couple of reasons. One, intellectual development. They went to university, read Karl Marx and a few other lefties, and then sort of saw the light. That's one route. No, let's be blunt about it. There might be people here whose primary role into public engagement was through the benefit and luxury and privilege of making it to university. Because let's be clear, making it to university is a privilege. Another way people advance to activism is by witnessing an injustice. When you see somebody when you see a brutality and that moves you in a way. Third way is where people around you who you respect and admire and so on actually, take the time to actually, talk you through things, expose you to things and so on. So the journey for activism is not like you wake up one day and you think, okay, I want to transform the world. It's always a process. So, and I can give you a very practical example. when Greenpeace was waging a campaign a couple of years ago to get companies to stop buying palm oil and paper and wood from newly deforested areas in the Sumatran rainforest in Indonesia, we ran a campaign against Mattel, the toy company, right? And we ran this campaign where, you know, Barbie, right? Barbie, not Ken, for some strange reason. Barbie is wrapped up in materials that came from the Sumatran rainforest. For some reason, Ken was wrapped in something else. And so there was this little advert we did, right? You know, where Ken gets the story that Barbie was, you know, in some photo shoot in Sumatra and what have you, and he's, you know, he made, and then there's a big poster, and we went to Mattel's headquarters and we hung up a big banner where Ken said, "Barbie, it's over. I don't date girls that are into deforestation." And so within 6 weeks, I'm answering the question, how does incrementalism look like, right? And within 6 weeks, the company, Mattel, broke its contract with Asian Pulp and Paper. I'm seeing my Indonesian friends nodding in familiarity there. They broke the contract with Asian Pulp and Paper, and similarly, we did 10 different things with Nestle, with KFC, and so on, and we got about 10 contracts broken of Asian Pulp and Paper, which then brought Asian Pulp and Paper to the table to negotiate with us, and they agreed to 100% of what Greenpeace and other campaigners were actually advocating, right? Almost 100%, let me not say. And in some cases, they went a little bit further, in some cases, they were a little. So, but if you think about it, so there was, you know, on the website of Greenpeace, we announced that this was a success, and then I got hit by a whole bunch of people saying, "Ha, you worried about the packaging. What about what goes inside the packaging?" And they're right. I mean, Barbie. Why should we be producing Barbie? How much of fossil fuels goes into Barbie? You know, and so on. So that, in my mind, was an incremental intervention. It wasn't transformative, right? But does it have its place or does it not have its place? Now, we can have different views on it, and we have the right to have different views on it. But that campaign brought 3 million people who were not involved in Greenpeace up to that point into the campaign. And then, you know, you're hoping that they go beyond just the packaging for Barbie, but so that's, for me, is an example of incrementalism. And over time, I've come to the view that while we have to push that what the world needs is fundamental transformative change, that in fact, we need to recognize that people will enter from different vantage points, and that's going to happen, and it's happening on a significant scale at the moment. Religious institutions and so on are getting involved. And what I'm saying is good organizers will not keep people out of the movement because they're not as politically perfect as those of us who've been in the movement unsuccessfully to a large extent for a long time. The only other question that I want to note but not answer was the question that was posed by the gentleman in the back about whether Greenpeace has become more impactful on climate change or not. You know, since I was there, I think that would be. Oh, sorry,
The question was whether Greenpeace is less of an obstacle to effective action on climate change than after you left and it was before.
Or after I left.
Greenpeace's role in a lot of the climate negotiations has been extremely problematic, not least in promoting carbon credits and market-based solutions like that. So, I mean, my question was whether, as a result of your influence, particularly your influence in bringing social justice issues, Greenpeace was less of an obstacle than before you arrived.
Okay.
Not being necessarily that good.
Yeah. No. I'm glad you put it that way. And you see, that, I must say, is the kind of, a little bit, if you don't mind me, that mindset of what's behind the question is what I'm actually saying is a little bit unhelpful. right? Because to make an absolute judgment on an organization that has, you know, which operates in complexity and at the end where I don't have a chance to respond is not good intellectual engagement, right? But I would say to you, I'm happy to have a public engagement with you on it in more depth because I can't do that right now. But I'm going to understand your question this way, that since I've left, do I think there will be a regression on the social justice and broader thing? Oh, no, whether I was able to make the change. I went in with a big agenda, right? And again, this is a good example of where there's a big, so I went in with lots of things to do. I think part of it was to make Greenpeace more people-centric. Part of it was to embrace working in alliances. Part of it was to do with being more social justice oriented. On almost everything that I went in, I would say that by the time I left, I did not feel that I achieved 100% of what I was trying to do on everything that I was trying to do. But nobody ever does, right? But how I did and how well I did, that's, you know, judgment that others should make. However, I think that even if you look at an organization like Greenpeace or any other of the union movement and so on, I think there are two things, and maybe this is a good way for me to end in a provocative way. There are two things that I think would be good investment of time on the part of academics who are analyzing things. One is learn to communicate like human beings. Right? For myself, when I came from Oxford back home, I went into the adult education movement and I realized I'd learned so much of unhelpful jargon at Oxford that I was talking in ways that people said, what? You know, and so one thing, no, I'm being very serious here. If you want to be part of a genuine global public effort to make the world a better, more sustainable place, investing time in being able to understand how to communicate in a way a much broader public can understand what you're saying and not just a handful of elitist people that made it to university is a critical challenge, right? And I think it's a good thing to do and make time. Because quite often what we do as activists or as progressive academics is we project our own consciousness on the people that we are organizing and we expect them to be where we are. And when they are not there, we get frustrated and sometimes even abusive to people of not being as smart or as political or as radical as we need them to be. The second investment is about understanding institutions and organizations, both in the state and in the public sector, whether it's trade unions or whether it's NGOs and so on. Because to understand how difficult it is to change institutional, because we wrote about changes in education systems. And basically she shows that in fact, even when you had the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution and so on, there are certain institutions that are so impervious to change, so resistant to change. You can have a whole revolution, but certain institutions like the education system stays largely in place. So I think what I find sometimes is that there is a gap, an intellectual gap. But the intellectual gap is not about complicated theory. It's about the practicalities of actually how real institutions work on a day-to-day basis and the problematics and real kind of crap that you actually have to deal with. And I say this to you, it might sound as if I'm being too strong in the way I'm saying it, but I'm saying it actually from a point of humility. These are journeys that I've not completed yet, I'm struggling with, I'm traveling them, and I'm challenging myself of when I make a judgment of an institution or a structure, I want to make sure that in judging that person, like if we look at Christiana Figueres, for example, the head of UNFCCC. Now, some people love her, some people hate her, some people are more neutral. Now me, when I look at her, I'm going to make a judgment on her performance, not on simply what she says and what the outcome is. I need to understand what is that institutional reality, the balance of political forces she has to deal with, etc., etc., etc. There are some things that are obvious that I can reach a conclusion on. A lot of the things, unless you actually invest a little time into understanding the context, you actually do a disservice to yourself in terms of your analysis, and then sometimes you might do a disservice in terms of how judgments are made. But to end, I would say that we are at a moment where there's so much of fluidity. Nothing is static at the moment. Everything that I said here today, in 2 years' time, could be completely obsolete and irrelevant. And that's the kind of humility I think that is needed now in academia and in intellectual life. And I also would end with a rallying call that we must acknowledge today that our universities are as captured, in many cases, as other institutions. That part of the challenge, that the way I see an audience like this, is that you have carved out in your different institutions a progressive space. I mean, some of you might be lucky if you come from an entire university that is radical and left and progressive and so on. But that's quite rare these days. And most of us are having to find a space within a university, carve out a kind of niche and push the agenda from there. And I would like to say that unless universities are reclaimed as spaces for significant alternative thinking, courageous alternatives being presented, and a space of serious activism like it was in previous times, I think that for many of the struggles that we faced before, we won't succeed. So I would like to wish each and every one of you all the best of luck, courage, and strength in the struggles that you have to face in your day-to-day life in the different institutions that you're working in, and rest assured, the world needs you to succeed. Thank you very much.
Okay, as always, there's so much more to say than we have time for. We need to end the official session here. So thank you all for coming so much. Let's give a big round of applause, please, to our two speakers. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will reconvene tomorrow for a further round of discussions. Thank you.